So good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you all to our program today on vaccine education ambassador training. I know we are joined by many from the Biden-Harris Presidential Inaugural Committee. Thank you for joining. Many of our Weill Cornell medicine colleagues, those at New York Presbyterian, Hunter College, all around New York City, the DC area. I see you, and thank you for joining. We have members of Black and Latino men in medicine here. Thank you for joining and welcome. I see many of our friends and colleagues here. I hope my barber was also able to log on. We welcome you all. We appreciate you coming. My name is Marcus Lambert, and before I introduce my esteemed colleagues, I just want to take a moment to go over the structure of our talk today. We really aim to create an environment where everyone feels welcome and safe. So any behavior or video using the chat box that displays any sort of disrespect towards others or anything, we're just going to ask you to stop or you'll be removed. We ask that everyone remain on mute unless we ask you to unmute for the joining in on the question and answer, which is at the end. You're welcome to utilize the chat throughout the presentation to send the hosts and the co-host questions. We have several people monitoring the chat, and we'll do our best to address as many questions as possible. And we're recording this session, so if you miss anything, no worries, we'll send it to you via email. And we're recording even the question and answer, just so you know, and we'll share the slides after this as well. So our talk today will cover who we are and our purpose while we're doing this today. We'll talk about vaccine hesitancy. And since this is a very diverse audience, we have a lot of, physicians, non-healthcare workers, healthcare workers, many different types of people here. We're going to cover some of the basics about COVID vaccines. And then our beloved Dr. Morales will go over some strategies for talking with others about the vaccine. And then we'll move right into the question and answer, which I think will be the meat of our presentation here today. So I'd like to take a moment to tell you about who we are. I'm joined today by Dr. Susana Morales, a native New Yorker and internal medicine doc. She is an associate professor of clinical medicine and vice chair for diversity in the Weill Cornell Department of Medicine. She's also the director and principal investigator of the Weill Cornell Diversity Center of Excellence of the Cornell Center for Health Equity. So we're grateful to have her with us. I'm also joined by Dr. Lenny Golightly, an infectious disease and physician scientist, associate professor of clinical medicine, microbiology, and immunology, and associate dean of diversity and inclusion at Weill Cornell Medicine. Dr. Golightly's research often takes her to countries around the world. So we're really lucky to have her infectious disease and global health expertise here today. We're also joined by Dr. Kevin Holcomb, who is a prominent obstetrician and gynecologist, vice chairman of gynecology, and recently appointed as associate dean for admissions at Weill Cornell Medicine. So grateful to have him here as well. Last but not least, Dr. Avelino Amato was recruited to Weill Cornell a little over a year and a half ago to help with diversity and inclusion efforts for the graduate school. His background is in kinesiology, and he's very much a data scientist. So he'll be moderating our question and answer portion today. And finally, I'm a biomedical scientist and social scientist by training, and I happen to serve as assistant dean for diversity and student life at the Weill Cornell Graduate School at Weill Cornell Medicine. So we're all here today as friends and colleagues who really want to help others make an informed decision about COVID-19 vaccines. Over the last few weeks, we've talked about the best way to do that. And I think, with the help of our team here, particularly Dr. Morales, we really settled on this idea. And that is, imagine that if every one of you were equipped with the tools, no matter if you're a healthcare provider or not, but you have the tools to be able to speak with your family, your colleagues, your friends about the COVID-19 vaccines. And not in a way that you're trying to convince them, to take the vaccine, take the vaccine, take the vaccine. No, we're really trying to have conversation, and we want to help people make an informed decision on the facts and what we know about the vaccines, and that they're safe and effective. So we're really here on a special day. This is our National Day of Service. And I think we're following the example of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the sense that we're really trying to help empower individuals, to strengthen communities, to bridge barriers, and find solutions to a global problem. And despite, I think, the equitable nature of this virus, it's affecting nations worldwide, our social structures have led to inequitable incidents, access, and even deaths for many communities. And as Dr. King widely warned us, of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health is the most shocking and the most inhuman because it often results in physical death. So we're here to maximize our impact by hosting a training for those who are interested in sharing information about the COVID-19 vaccines and to help to save lives. That's the bottom line, especially in vaccine hesitant communities and those most impacted by COVID-19. So I want to start by providing a little update on where we are. Since January 21st of last year, there have been 23 million cases of COVID-19 and almost 400,000 deaths. And as you can see in the total number of cases, as you see in the blue, has risen really quickly in the last few months. If we look, just yesterday, there were 200,000 new cases and over 3,000 new deaths. So even the rate of these new cases has been going up over time. And this has disproportionately affected communities of color. Nationally, Black, Hispanic, Native American cases and deaths are exceeding their share of the population, as you see in the red and orange bars here. If the population represents the gray bar, the share of deaths and the share of cases have consistently exceeded that for Black, Hispanic, and Native Americans. And Black, Hispanics, and those of lower income are more likely to be concerned that they will get COVID and require hospitalization, and they're more concerned that they might unknowingly spread it to others. But there is hope. It's not all doom and gloom. The majority of Americans, I think now, as of November 2020, according to this study, say that they would be willing to get a vaccine for the coronavirus. And I think this willingness is increasing, even for Black and Hispanic groups. And there's been studies to show that. So when we think about the COVID vaccine and willingness to take the vaccine, I think we should think about it on a continuum, with those who will refuse the vaccine on one side and those who are promoting it or even demanding it on the other side. And that leaves a large space in the middle for those who might either passively accept or generally be hesitant about getting vaccinated. Many of these individuals have a sort of wait and see approach. Oh, I'm going to wait and see, after you take it. And I think many of those individuals are still seeking clarity and information on the vaccines as they come to their own decisions. We know that there are certain groups that are more likely to be vaccine hesitant. Based on this study, Republicans are at the top of the list, followed by those who are in the age range of 30 to 49, rural residents, Black adults, essential workers, independents, even healthcare workers. And I think, among these particular groups, there are many of these individuals within our network if they don't already identify, characteristics of ourselves. According to another study, most people are concerned about potential side effects and safety. And I think those are the top two things for why people are not wanting to be vaccinated against COVID-19. And I think in this talk, we'll talk about safety and the effectiveness of the vaccines. But again, we know that vaccine hesitancy varies from person to person. Some of this is because of racism or mistreatment in healthcare. Some is from politicizing masks and vaccines. There are also groups of anti-vaxxers who are promoting their agenda. And some may be from suspicion of pharmaceutical industries or, the government more broadly. So as we kind of embark on this training here today, I want to prepare you for the conversations that you might be having with your families, your coworkers, your colleagues, and your friends. And I think one of the things that we want to recommend is the first step is you have to make a decision about what you're going to choose to do about the vaccinations. I think, we're not hiding that we're not neutral. Again, this is about having a conversation around vaccination education and what the facts are. But we also ourselves, many of us are going to get the vaccine or have gotten the vaccine. So you have to make your own decision. And then don't wait to have those conversations. Engage with people now and engage in effective conversations. I know it's tempting to get pulled into an argument with Uncle John, but we want the conversations to be effective. And of course, be prepared for questions. So with that, I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Morales to tell you more about the vaccines themselves.
Thank you, Dr. Lambert, and hi, everyone. Very happy to be here on this Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day of Service after a year of so much turmoil to talk about COVID-19 vaccines. Many of my colleagues, friends, family, and many of my patients have had COVID, so this is personal. I am a primary care doctor, and when the news came out that new vaccines were on their way, I promised my patients that I would personally review the research before I would recommend a vaccine to any of them or to take one myself. And that's what I have done. And that's what our group that's meeting with you today has done. People do have a lot of questions and concerns, which is totally understandable. And all of us on the panel today want to share what we have learned about the COVID vaccines to help people make decisions and equip you with tools to talk about it with others. So how do these COVID-19 mRNA vaccines work? In general, a vaccine works by showing the immune system a mugshot of the thing that you're trying to protect against. And in the case of the mRNA vaccines for COVID, they have copied a little piece of the vaccine, which is the little spike proteins that are on top of the vaccine. And so it's not a live vaccine. That's one of the concerns I've heard. This is not a live vaccine. It's basically a mugshot to give a warning so that if any real coronavirus ever tries to enter the body, it will be recognized, attacked, and neutralized. And what happens whenever you make a vaccine, what you're trying to do is provoke antibody production and protection without the person having the actual disease. That's, vaccines 101. But one of the big questions that people have is, how do I know this is safe and how do I know this works? So, and there's all this, crosstalk about clinical trials and have they, one of the, I would say actually the biggest concern, even before safe and effective, is it's too fast. That is the number one thing that people have said to me. And a lot of my patients have been like, I don't want to be the first one, which I get. But just so people are aware, you will not be the first one, because this is how clinical trials work. What a clinical trial means is a study to see whether a drug or a vaccine is safe and effective. And there are 4 different phases of any clinical trial. The first one has just a few people in it, just like 20 to 100. And the researchers try to answer the questions: is the vaccine safe? Are there any serious side effects? How does the dose relate to the side effects? And is it causing an immune response? So that's step 1. Step 2 is a bunch more volunteers, up to several hundred. And at that point, further study of side effects and protectiveness and whether the body is responding in terms of its immune system. Phase 3, which is this phase that we have just finished, is when more than 1,000 volunteers are recruited. And that's when you can actually see outcomes, how well the vaccine protects people against the disease. And in the case, as I'll show you in a minute, of both the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, which are the only ones that have been approved so far, which are made out of mRNA, which is a little tiny snippet of genetic material. that's a copy of the genetic material of the actual virus. Thousands of people have been enrolled in the trials. So we're right now in phase 4. After the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, approves a vaccine, they still keep on watching the people that were in the trial. And so that goes on for a couple of years so that the data still gets collected, because once in a while, new things come out. And we've seen that actually with these new vaccines. Next slide. So the question of it was too fast, does that mean that it was sloppy? Does that mean that it was careless? Does that mean that it was just, people trying to ram it through for, political gain? All those things have come up. And I was interested in this too, believe me, because I had to decide about myself getting the vaccine. What I learned was a lot of important things. Number one, that this accelerated vaccine development, this fast tracking, had many different pieces. And probably the most important one is that the researchers did not start from scratch. I honestly, even though I'm very interested in vaccines, and as a primary care doctor, I honestly talk about them like every single day of my life. I was learning about mRNA vaccines because they are a new method. And what I learned is that mRNA vaccines as a strategy, as a method, have been studied for many, many years, although this is the first time that they've actually been approved, and including in 2 types of coronaviruses. Coronavirus is a class of virus that includes COVID. Some of you may remember when there was an outbreak of what's called MERS, which now is down to a couple of sporadic cases, but people were really scared. We were very worried we were going to have MERS outbreaks in the hospital. SARS, another type of SARS virus, which also both of these caused very severe respiratory illness and pneumonia. And other types of viruses have been studied with this mRNA technology. The initial very first studies even go back to the 90s, but it's really in the last 10 years that it really revved up. And they've tried to develop vaccines for Zika, for Ebola, and other viruses. So there was a lot of study. But what happened when COVID came out, number one, is that the sequence of the virus's RNA, because this is an RNA virus, it has inside its envelope RNA, was identified in weeks by Chinese researchers, because that's where the virus first came out. And they published that for the entire world to know. And then basically everybody knew, because of the horrible first phase of this pandemic that was happening in China, that this was going to be bad if it got out, and it did, and it was, and it is. And so hundreds of vaccine teams around the world, in America and abroad, mobilized. Every vaccine researcher turned their focus to COVID. And these were public-private partnerships that worked to harness this new technology that isn't as new as we thought. But the new thing and the big breakthrough in the last few years was one of the barriers that had happened with other types of RNA vaccines was that RNA is very, very fragile, and you have to put it in an envelope of something. And what they finally discovered was a little fat globule that the RNA could sit in, that then could go in the syringe and could go in you. And that the only problem is that you have to keep that cold. So that's why this whole issue of like having to have, for the Pfizer vaccine, super cold freezers and refrigeration and all that business occurred. But that was a huge breakthrough. But honestly, the other vaccine trials that had happened with RNA vaccines hadn't been like perfect. There had been no other RNA vaccine approved. And when the Pfizer company, along with the researchers in Germany that devised this, and then the Moderna, along with the NIH group, worked on this, they had no idea what would happen, because the way that clinical trials work is that you recruit everybody, you make sure that it's safe, you start administering, and then you watch. And they didn't know until and it's done without you knowing which vaccine you got and the researchers don't know until later. And then they do something called unblinding. Then they look and see what happened to the patients, and I'll tell you that in a moment. The final thing that I think accelerated things is that the billions and billions of dollars that were invested in this. We know that COVID has decimated the world economy, has killed hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. And so what has happened is a huge investment, not only in the research efforts, but in production. Because unlike any previous vaccine effort, the decision was made that any viable vaccine candidate, anything that was doing well in its initial phases of the trials, they would rev up the production. So the moment it was proven that it worked, it would get disseminated out. And that is something that's partly why everybody's kind of reeling. Overnight, we hear, oh, there's a vaccine trial, and oh, you can go get it, down the street in the hospital or in the clinic or wherever. And so people have been a little bit startled by that rapid response. Unfortunately, I think, the public education hasn't been perfect in this area, along with a lot of stumbles about many things about COVID in this country. And that's one of them. That's the gap that we're trying to fill. But in all honesty, it was hard to do complete public education because nobody knew which vaccines were actually going to work. The other thing to be aware of is that there are other vaccines in the pipeline. And so this discussion that we're having now is only about the first two that have been approved. And we probably will be having other discussions later if the other ones work too. But for right now, I guess the final thing I'll mention is that, as you can see here in the red, regulatory review was also expedited because, there's a lot of bureaucracy and paperwork and, getting people together and figuring out when you're going to have the meetings. Everything is slow motion sometimes with government bureaucracy. But this time there was no slow motion. They mobilized their reviewers in the Food and Drug Administration and in the CDC. Just so you know, those reviewers are independent of the drug companies. They're not paid by the drug companies. They have no personal interest in what happens with those vaccines. And they review the literature and the data in extreme detail to decide whether they think it's safe and it's effective. And they decided for both vaccines that both of them were safe and effective and that they could be released. Next slide. So this is the breakdown of what happened. For the Pfizer one, which was the first one that was approved, about 44,000 people were enrolled. And the way that a clinical trial is done is that half of those people are enrolled in the group that gets the vaccine and half of them doesn't. And they basically then watch and see what happens. They go about their life like anybody else. They don't know if they got the vaccine or not. Nobody knows until they crack the code later. These trials were done in around the world, but also in 39 states. And they were very careful to recruit a diverse group of people to volunteer, including a lot of people of color. About a quarter of the people that participated in the trial were also healthcare workers. Of course, healthcare workers are at high risk for getting COVID, and so there's a lot of interest in enrolling them. And many people were middle-aged and above, although in this trial, they did enroll young people 16 and up, a small number. The Moderna vaccine enrolled 30,000 people, 15,000 got the vaccine, 15,000 people got the saltwater make-believe vaccine injection. They didn't know which one they got. And again, studied around the world, studied in a lot of America, lots of diversity of patients, and many people that were elderly. What's not in this slide, in addition, is that many people had chronic disease, because that's another thing that's come up from my patients. A lot of people were diabetic, hypertensive, overweight, obese, had chronic lung disease, because they were trying to give a snapshot of the world's population. The only people that weren't enrolled are people with, pregnant women, and small children, and then a few people with some chronic illnesses that if they were unstable and ill, they were not enrolled, but otherwise, yes. Next. And the results. And this is what when I saw this, honestly, this is what was most compelling to me. First of all, they're more than 90%, actually almost 100%, right? 95 and 94.5% protective against COVID. With the Pfizer one, at the end of when they opened up the secret box to see who got which, what they found was that 160 people were in the placebo group. The people that didn't get the vaccine is called placebo, and only eight were in the vaccine group. And of those eight, only one person had severe COVID. The group that got placebo, 30 got severe COVID. So that is a difference of a risk reduction of 95%. Very impressive. Almost unheard of really in other vaccine trials to have that massive a difference. And an almost identical result happened with the Moderna vaccine. They're done a little bit differently. The Pfizer one is 21 days apart. The Moderna one is 28 days apart. But like I mentioned, large numbers of people were in these trials. With the Moderna one, 90 people in the placebo group got COVID, only 5 in the vaccine group. Next slide. So what about side effects and safety? Well, these vaccines, like many vaccines, are expected to produce some side effects after vaccination, especially after the second dose. Probably the most important thing was injection site pain. People also reported headache, muscle aches, fever. Some people felt tired. But the most important thing is that nobody died of these vaccines. But we know that COVID will kill you. So when I looked at this, I was like, I could get COVID and potentially end up on a respirator or even die, or take a vaccine that doesn't harm you in any way. Now, the fastness thing again. So at least 8 weeks of safety data were gathered in those phase 3 trials, which is a point where they opened up the code and they looked and they submitted them to the FDA. Now, where did 8 weeks come from? Well, it doesn't come out of a hat. Actually, it's because with all of the prior vaccines that have been approved, you rarely, if ever, see any major effects after 8 weeks, because that's one of the questions I've gotten. I've been doing a lot of presentations with our staff, with other people, and they ask, well, what about long-term side effects? What if you get something later? The reality is that it is extremely unusual to have long-term side effects from a vaccine. If anything is going to happen, it's going to happen soon after. Next slide. Let's go back for a minute. So the soon after is the point. And so I mentioned that phase 4 is looking at after approval, what happens. So the thing that's coming out after approval is mainly the issue about allergies, allergic reactions. That is something that has some people concerned, of course. The reason I think that probably those are coming out now after they have been released is because one of the criteria for not being enrolled in this study is if you had a history of severe allergic reactions. And when I talk about severe, I'm talking about a condition called anaphylaxis, which is when your mouth and your throat swell up. You can even go into shock. You develop horrible hives. It's a very severe allergic reaction that can be life-threatening. And so they did not want to enroll those people and put them at risk for a vaccine candidate that hadn't even been proven to work yet. So they were not enrolled in the trials. And when you look at the people, most of the people that have had, since the vaccines were released, have had an allergic reaction like that, have been people that had prior severe allergic reactions. And that's why now the recommendation is not that you can't get it if you have anaphylaxis, but that you need to be prepared, like bringing your EpiPen. Any of you that have had anaphylaxis, you have an EpiPen, most likely. And if you have any questions, you should talk about it with your doctor or your allergist. But it's not actually a contraindication to the COVID vaccine. It does mean that they watch you longer if you've had a severe allergic reaction, or even if you have a family history of a severe allergic reaction. Instead of the 15 minutes that they want to watch you after the dose, they want to watch you for at least a half an hour, because that's when it usually happens. It's called immediate allergic reaction. It happens right away. Even the people that have had them, and they're an extremely small number, this is a treatable problem. You give people medicines like Benadryl and other stuff, and it's, you fix it. So next slide. One of the arguments has been, well, isn't it better to just get the disease and get it over with? And for those of you older folks in the call, you may remember chickenpox parties where I think my mother had a chickenpox party. There was no chickenpox vaccine once upon a time. And when the little friends would get it, they would be like, well, let's just get it over with. Some people have made the argument you should do the same thing about COVID. It's better to get the natural disease and get it over with. Nobody does chickenpox parties anymore because we have a varicella vaccine. And the problem with that concept here is that, is that COVID can kill you. And so if you just wait for everyone to get COVID, we already have almost 500,000 deaths in America. We're talking about potentially millions of people that would die of COVID if we go for what's called natural immunity. So we believe, I certainly believe that the risk of severe illness and death from COVID far outweighs any benefit of natural immunity. And that the COVID-19 vaccine will help protect you by creating an antibody response without the risk of severe illness. One of the things that comes up is that we don't know how even if you've had COVID, it is still recommended for you to get the vaccine. That's because we don't know how long the protection from natural COVID lasts. Everybody knows that we give boosters for certain illness, with certain other types of vaccines, and that even with the flu shot, you get ideally you get a vaccine every year, partly to boost your immune response, partly because of all the new strains of flu that appear every year. The same thing is relevant here, so that the hope is that getting a vaccine will boost your immunity even more to protect you and the people around you. Next slide. All right, so the other piece of our talk, though, is about how to talk about vaccination. Vaccines have always been controversial ever since they first were discovered. The very first vaccines were the vaccines against smallpox, and the way that you vaccinated is with a type of virus called cowpox. This was in the 1700s. So back then they said, oh, you're going to turn into a cow. So there's always been anxiety, fear, kind of weird ideas, because you do not turn into a cow from that, and so forth. But the idea of that putting something in your body to protect you does feel strange to people ever since. There's always this anxiety back and forth. And I think that what we need to do if we're going to talk about vaccination with our friends, family, colleagues, patients, is that you have to start from a place of respect, empathy, and understanding. Next. There's a lot, one of the challenges, especially now in the social media era, is that there is a fire hose of information coming into people's phones and thus into their brains. Facebook, Twitter, everything. There's tons of stuff in there. And for most people, it is very hard to know what information can I trust, what's reliable. But the other thing that I've learned from looking into all of this and thinking about this issue of both vaccine education and understanding where my patients are coming from and my colleagues and friends, is that with many of the things that people ask you, there is a little kernel of truth that sometimes then gets distorted, and so so it's really important to know what the real deal is to be able to address misinformation or disinformation, because some of it is just honest fear. Some of it is actually a little bit more, propaganda-ish. It's a whole mixture. Next. And I think what's really important is to listen to and respond to questions. I have had really brilliant questions that people have asked me that I did not know the answers to, and I had to go and look it up. So for example, one of the fears that is out in the internet and wherever is this idea of trackers, that it's not really a vaccine, that somebody's injecting a tracker into you. So that on the surface, that sounds to some like a crazy question, because how would that be even doable? But the real issue is that there has been talk about a certain type of tracker. Number one, a device to attach to the vaccine vials to track when they were given, so that they could figure out about inventory of when vaccines were given, where they were given, to be able to restock, stuff like that. So that's one part of the tracker idea. And the other part of the tracker idea is not that the COVID vaccine is a tracker, because it isn't, but there has been an interest in how are you going to track in developing countries where they don't have a immunization card that they can keep safe, and there is no vaccine registry, right? In New York City, when you vaccinate your kid, there's a computerized vaccine registry. Any pediatrician that you take your kid to can see when did they get their last measles shot. In developing countries, that doesn't exist. And a lot of the UNICEF and the World Health Organization and foundations that are working on childhood vaccination around the world are interested in how can we track whether these babies have had their vaccines. So there has been all kinds of crosstalk about how do you track vaccination, but the COVID vaccine is not a tracker. So, so on the surface, it sounds crazy, but underneath it, it's somebody wrote an article or gave an interview somewhere, and suddenly it gets morphed into this whole other thing. You need to proactively explain side effects. It is unrealistic to tell people, you don't want to hide that they're going to get a side effect, and tell them what they want to, what they should expect. Because that's probably one of the things that people are most anxious about. Next. And then you want to share your own story. So if you've had the vaccine, tell people about it. If you're, if you haven't had it yet, because you're not the right age group or other category, you want to share whether you've decided to do it and why. My own story is that after I got it, you can see I'm pretty ecstatic right here in this picture of me. I literally danced after I got it, because I was on the COVID ward in April, taking care, our hospital was 100% COVID. Every single bed was COVID. We had multiple new ICUs of people on respirators. New York was the first very hard hit part of the country. And, it is tragic to me that so many other parts of the country are now living through what we lived through. And of course, it's been ticking up in New York. And now my anxiety, honestly, is that there are new strains of COVID that the vaccine appears to protect you against, but that are super even more contagious. And what I think I'm worried about, and what a lot of the vaccine scientists and epidemiologists are worried about, is that that's going to lead to kind of a third wave, or maybe that it's a big part of this new second wave. So I was really, really, really happy that I got the vaccine. I just had my second one. I actually only got a sore arm, nothing else. And my other part of my story is about my mom. She's 86. And it's been a little bit of a headache tracking down a vaccine for her, but finally we tracked down, she's going to get a Baptist church vaccine in a Baptist church tomorrow. And I am extremely ecstatic about that. She has been, every single time I talk to her, she's like, when am I going to get my vaccine? So it's been a little embarrassing because I'm a doctor and I'm talking about vaccines and I haven't been able to line one up for her, but she's finally getting it tomorrow. Next. If you're going to speak to groups, because some of us are planning maybe to reach out to congregations, to students, many of us may be speaking with groups. The way you become a trusted messenger is to do your homework and read about this and learn about this. And that's part of what we're doing. And I've read a lot of stuff, but I've also looked at webinars and listened to Dr. Fauci and all that other stuff. But in general, for public health authorities, what they talk about is you need to target the message to your audience and address their questions and concerns, which is what we're going to do today. You need to try to mainly emphasize safety and effectiveness, not only the bad news, but give people also some good news, which is safe, effective, carefully done research. You don't want to overuse statistics or graphs because people zone out, and speak about your own personal experience and your own journey to make your own decision. And the people that you can reach out to, of course, are extended family, any civic organization that you're involved with. It's harder now in a way because COVID restrictions, but in a way it's also easier. You can reach out to your fraternity brothers and sisters, sorority sisters from all around the country and give them a talk about COVID vaccines, classmates, community leaders, etc. Next. So back to the issue of trusted information. The CDC and the FDA have websites that are continually updated. Your state and local health department, this is the state health department. There's also a New York City Department of Health website that also gets updated. And what you can find on these is not only updated information about the vaccines, but also PowerPoint slides if you want to give a presentation with current information. But another thing I just do want to mention about this issue of trust and trusted messengers, that one of the problems with the extreme politicization of COVID and the vaccination process, and also the politicization of science and the bungled approach to COVID, especially by the federal government, has been that people were not really trusting anything that the government was saying about safety and effectiveness. And that's why important organizations like the National Medical Association, which is the National Association of Black Doctors, said before the vaccines came out, we're going to have our own review committee that is going to review safety on our own. And they, along with other groups of, the National Black Nurses Association and other groups, have independently reviewed the data, safety, and effectiveness data and independently recommended that Americans be vaccinated. Other resources that I've used are the World Health Organization, and there's an organization called Gavi, which is a global vaccine alliance. That's a combination of the World Health Organization, UNICEF, and foundations that works on vaccines around the world, especially for kids. They have a lot of up-to-date information, including some nice little videos that you can use to educate people about how vaccines work. Next. All right, thanks for your attention. Sorry if I went over, Marcus, I don't know if I did.
That's okay. Next up, we have Dr. Avelino Amato, who's gonna share his story and lead us in the question and answer.
Hey everyone, thanks for being here with us today. It's awesome to see this many people encouraged to learn and to want to share their information. So as one of the people who falls into that category that's at the top, that's most resistant to taking this, I think it's incredibly important that we all really think. So I'm 32 years old. And for me, up until the summer, I was pretty hesitant to take the vaccine, very honestly. But reality is I'm a scientist, and by good faith, I believe in data. And I think when the data started coming out and reading about the vaccines, and more importantly, learning about that this has been information that we've been building for a couple decades now in terms of the platform delivery. And so what I really got to understanding that this was more or less just an issue of bad branding in terms of Operation Warp Speed and the name. And this is some of the things that came up in conversation. And basically my entire family had COVID, and my mom was on oxygen for 4 days in the hospital. So, and there's other people around me that are immunocompromised. So I being a scientist and being a person that wants to be careful, made the decision that when I'm available to take the vaccine, I definitely will be taking it. And I've reached that decision not because anybody or any physicians told me I should, but because I did my own research. And I think that's ultimately the message we're sending out there today. I have full faith that is safe and effective for everyone, and that I hope that you leave this session today, being critical of that as well, being critical of the process, yes, and we encourage that critique, but also understanding that there's enough data out there, and there's going to continue to be more data on how effective and safe these drugs are. So, without further ado, we've received a few questions that each of the panel members will be addressing. And these are pretty common questions. Once these questions get addressed, you can feel free to send me a direct message with a question. We'll do our best to answer everyone's question, but we hope that you stay here for us because with us throughout this question and answer section, because there might be something that we might have not covered during the actual slide presentation that'll be relevant to you in your decision-making process. So the first question that I will bring to the panel is, should I get the vaccine if I'm pregnant? Will this affect my unborn child?
Good morning, everyone, and happy MLK Day. As Dr. Morales, Dr. Lambert mentioned in the beginning, I'm a GYN oncologist by trade and trained in obstetrics and gynecology. And so this specific question is something that I addressed multiple times as the word of a vaccine was coming out. And now I see how important it is of a question, because whenever you're making a decision, you have to weigh the risks and the benefits of some intervention. And this question was, are pregnant women at increased risk for bad outcomes from COVID? And in the beginning, when this was starting, it was unclear, but it's not unclear anymore. There have been multiple reports showing that compared to non-pregnant women, pregnant women do have worse outcomes. The overall risk is low, but they have higher risk of being intubated, going to an ICU, and even death. And so you have to understand that pregnant women are a high-risk group, and it's one of the things that the CDC is using to prioritize people for vaccination. Now that's strange because, as Dr. Morales mentioned in her study, in her talk, was that pregnant women were not allowed onto the trials, and that's not uncommon. It's rare for pregnant women to be allowed onto early trials of new medications. In the case of these two messenger RNA vaccines, there are always a group of studies that are done in animal models that closely resemble humans. They're called DART studies. They're development and reproductive toxicity studies. And normally those studies are done and they show, well, in this animal model that has been shown to be similar enough to humans to accurately predict what happens in pregnancy, once you get that DART data, then you can start enrolling pregnant women. Unfortunately, when these trials started, that DART data was not available. But now that we've got the initial evidence of safety and efficacy in the general population, we do have published DART data on Moderna. And from what I understand, Pfizer is not published yet, but I understand it also shows the same thing, that there are no safety concerns with regard to reproduction. And so while the American Congress of Obstetrics and Gynecology really pushed for pregnant women to get onto these trials in the first place, to those who say that this process was rushed and safety was not paramount, the FDA said, no, you cannot put pregnant women on until we get this data. They will be enrolling women on these pregnant women now. It should be rolling out soon now that the DART data is there to see the efficacy and safety in that specific population. But given the fact that they're at higher risk, what should they do now? Well, ACOG recommends that you should not withhold a vaccination to a pregnant woman. We need to discuss the risks and the benefits and acknowledge the fact that they were not on these trials. But that if you have a designation for priority by the CDC for vaccination and you're pregnant, you should be vaccinated if you choose to be. And ACOG was that's the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, was very concerned about a woman being forced to have a consultation with their doctor, an obstetrician, if they chose to be vaccinated. And so ACOG says a woman doesn't have to have a specific consultation. If she chooses not to be vaccinated, she should be supported in that decision. If she chooses to be vaccinated during pregnancy, you have to make people aware of the side effects. People are going to be nervous about the sore arm, the headache, the fever. You got to be prepared for those things. And Tylenol is safe in pregnancy. And it's recommended that if a woman's having those sort of inflammatory side effects, that you offer them Tylenol. Just like outside of pregnancy, you can't, it's not recommended you line up this vaccination with other vaccinations. So if you're getting Tdap, you're getting influenza, they should be separated by at least 2 weeks, just like outside of pregnancy. While we're going to wait for those new studies to enroll pregnant women, it should be mentioned that a few of the people on the Pfizer and Moderna trial got pregnant, and they're being followed. It's not large numbers, but there's at least 25 or so women who got pregnant, but there's been over 600 pregnant women who have been vaccinated since the rollout. they're all being followed, and the FDA has these systems for reporting adverse outcomes set up. There's one called VAERS, there's one called vSafe, and I hope we are able to share the sign up for these things. If you get vaccinated, you should sign up for vSafe. It's on your phone. It's a handheld program, and if you're having any sort of adverse event, you can report it. That's part of that phase 4 surveillance that Dr. Morales was talking about. So I would just like to say that while there is no pregnant women on the initial trials for Moderna and Pfizer's vaccine, the animal model data suggests that it's safe in pregnancy, and it's recommended that a woman who wants to get the vaccine should have no barriers in doing so.
Thank you, Dr. Holcomb.
Can you address the fertility thing? Because that's the other thing that people have, I think the fact that pregnant women weren't studied has meant that people are afraid that it'll hurt their fertility. Can you just address that?
And that's part of the those DART trials is looking to see if you give really high doses of vaccine to this animal, in this case rats, before they become pregnant, during pregnancy, you're looking to see is there any evidence that it impacts fertility rates, and there's no evidence that it does. Keeping in mind, one of the reasons why these trials got done so fast was unfortunately COVID was rampant in the United States while they're doing them. So there's lots of people who got COVID during this time. So we also don't have a signal just in natural COVID infection that infertility is part of that that side effect of long haul COVID infection.
Thank you, Dr. Holcomb. So that was actually your next question about the sexual function. So we'll move on.
Well,
the COVID vaccine.
Evelyn, I do want to address something about sexual function because all my comments were really largely pointed at women's concerns. I think what's an interesting thing about sexual dysfunction with COVID is that we're starting to learn now that COVID infection causes sexual dysfunction in men. There's enough evidence to say that erectile dysfunction is associated with COVID infection. And it shouldn't be surprising. There's a biological plausible reason when you talk about things that stop blood flow, nervous issues, losing taste and smell, and COVID toes, all those things go into believing why it might cause erectile dysfunction. So while there's been no evidence that the vaccine causes erectile dysfunction, the infection that we're trying to prevent does. And so I want to mention that for men, if you're concerned, there's more concern on the infection side than on the vaccine side.
Thank you. The next question is, will the COVID vaccine become a yearly shot like the flu, or will it be like Tdap, where we only require a booster every couple of years?
Yeah, we don't know actually how long it will be. I should say that Tdap is every 10 years if you've had it once as an adult. And that just kind of gets to the point that you don't know yet. For many vaccines that we've had a long period of time where we've been able to observe, we've been able to see how long does it take before you actually need a booster to remind your immune system that it knows about the virus. So we just don't know. Out until the time that the studies were stopped, you did have protection. It was as good, if not better, than the actual disease. And we'll just have to see. But I think that the data now clearly shows that if you get the shot, it is apparently safe, effective, and will protect you against not only getting COVID, but in particular, it does appear to protect you against severe disease, which of course, what we all want to prevent.
Thank you, Dr. Golele. Next question is, will the vaccine keep me from getting infected with COVID-19?
I'll take this one. I think it's really important to try to understand what the clinical trials really got at. And the clinical trials for the COVID-19 vaccines, the first two that we've talked about, Pfizer and Moderna, they looked at those who were symptomatic for COVID, which is different than infection. So we know that the vaccines so far that have been approved for emergency use authorization are safe and 95% effective at symptomatic COVID and severe COVID.
Thank you, Dr. Lambert. Once vaccinated, can I feel safe spending unmasked time with friends who are also vaccinated?
I'll also take this one. People really shouldn't change their behavior once they get vaccinated. It's still important to wear masks. It's still important to practice social distancing and safe practices. Again, it's 95% effective, and that's a really fantastic number. However, we still want to have those safe practices that we're already, incorporating just for our own safety and the safety of others. And that's the other big thing too. It's not just about ourselves, it's about other people's safety as well. So the bottom line is that, you could be saving lives by continuing some of these practices as well.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Lambert. What about these, the underlying conditions, the high blood pressure, diabetes type 2, how are those affected by the vaccine?
Yeah, I can take that one. I think the issue is not so much how are they affected by the vaccine, but how is your chance of getting severe COVID affected by some of those underlying conditions. So it's known that patients with diabetes type 2, with chronic kidney disease, sickle cell anemia can have more severe disease. There is no evidence that patients with these diseases will have problems from the vaccine. So you're actually in a risk category where it would be better to get the vaccine than to risk having very severe COVID disease, which can lead to death.
So if I take the vaccine and I have an allergic reaction, who should I call?
So there's two pieces to that. I mentioned the severe allergic reaction, the anaphylaxis. Hopefully that will happen while you're sitting in your little chair for 30 minutes after you have your vaccination. And every vaccine site, because of this rare side effect, has to be equipped with all the medications and emergency personnel to address that. So I have a strong doubts that will happen outside of the medical setting. But if you're home and you experience something else and you're not sure what to do, what the recommendations are right now is to contact your physician. But one of the dilemmas is that a lot of people don't have a doctor. So A, we should all try to have a doctor. That's just general principle as a primary care doctor. So putting that plug in. But B, there are people that may reach out to the emergency room or an urgent center if you're not certain what to do. Luckily, though, it doesn't seem like allergic reactions are a prominent part of the post-vaccine time. So that's good. Like I said, the main things that people have reported are the occasional fever, just like, many of you are parents, just like when you take the baby to have their shots the next day, they may have a little temp, they may be cranky. Many of us are just baseline cranky anyway. So I wasn't cranky though. I was happy. Like I said, I was dancing. But you may be a little achy, you may be tired. I was able to work, after both vaccines. I actually felt better after the second one than the first one. So it's very individual, varies by the person. It seems to actually, interestingly, like older people have fewer side effects than younger people, which is the opposite of what you usually expect, but kind of great since older people are the ones that we especially want to get vaccinated now.
If I could just add to that, I think it's important to know that the only contraindications that are known for not taking the vaccine, or if you've had a severe reaction to a prior dose, or if you have an allergy to polyethylene glycol, which is found in some laxatives, or polysorbate, because it has some similar epitopes to those in polyethylene glycol. If you were allergic to any of those components, it's recommended that you speak with an allergist. Other than that, if you do have a history of anaphylaxis to other things, it is not a contraindication. As mentioned, you'll have to sit for a half an hour on the side and they'll observe you. Part of my journey was I was one of the people that had to sit for half an hour on the side because of my own medical history, and I was a little afraid. So look at all of the components in the vaccine. Make sure that you do not have a history of allergy. Feel free to reach out to your physician and recommend that other people do that too. But on the whole, it appears to be safe. There are no preservatives in the vaccines that have been approved. Again, that's something else that people worry about in vaccines. So make sure you do your homework. Advise anyone that you're giving advice to do their homework, but it really is just limited to those few categories where there are concerns about the safety of the vaccine.
All right, and final question in terms of the questions that we've had come to us before is, what is the difference between all of the current COVID vaccines available to us now?
So the two vaccines that have been approved are actually very similar. Like I mentioned earlier, they're mRNA vaccines. They are a copy of a snippet of the virus RNA that makes spike protein. They teach our body to make a little bit of spike protein to rev up the immune system. The new vaccines coming down the pike work by different methods. And once, if they are proven to work and they are coming to market, that's when we're going to have a whole new set of educational modules, because one of the issues is that it'll be really important to have multiple vaccines that work. There is not, everybody's been hearing about the headaches about the rollout. Part of the headaches about the rollout is there's this group of people that's desperate to get the vaccine. But there's been, it's been very bumpy around the country, certainly also in New York, that it's really hard to know where to get it. They run out of doses. They have to cancel the appointments. So it's honestly kind of a mess. But the other problem is that nationally, there isn't enough vaccine at present for the number of people that now qualify for it, which we didn't mention before, but right now the people that qualify are healthcare workers, certain frontline workers, including teachers, at least in your state, teachers, grocery store workers, et cetera, and then people over 65. That adds up to a lot of people in New York. And so in this moment, there is not enough vaccine of the two approved versions to vaccinate all those people. So the feeling is that internationally, in particular, maximizing the production of any vaccine that's found to work and to be effective is going to be really important. So there's probably going to be, unlike other scenarios with other vaccines that we're used to, we're probably going to have a bunch of them because all these brilliant scientists from around the world have been working on them. Probably going to have a bunch of them, and that'll be good, because if somebody does have the bad luck to be, for example, allergic to one of these RNA vaccines, it'll be a blessing if they can actually safely take a different type of vaccine and be protected against COVID. So, as well as it'll be extremely helpful to have vaccines that don't have such rigid rules about keeping cold and stuff like that, as we start to roll them out to the international space or to rural places where they don't have those very fancy high-tech freezers, et cetera. So part of the plan is to have a lot of different vaccines out and on the market.
Great. All right, everyone. So we've reached the portion now where the audience, and thank you for those who have asked all the insightful questions thus far. I'm going to go ahead and start addressing those questions to the panel. So the first question I received is, what is the benefit of injecting mRNA that codes for the spike protein as opposed to just injecting the spike protein?
I don't, right now we only have 2 vaccines that have been approved, and both use this messenger RNA strategy, but others in the pipeline are doing just that. They have subunit components of the spike protein that are just going to be directly injected. And I think it goes back for me to what Dr. Morales said. 95% efficacy is high for a vaccine. Lots of people get the flu vaccine every year. That's about 45% effective. I mean, so once you get up to 95% efficacy, I don't know how much higher it's going to get. Maybe some of these other vaccine trials will show them to be equally effective, but I think one thing that's been shown is that this strategy for messenger RNA for vaccines is exceedingly effective and safe. And so the other benefit is it's plug and play technology, meaning you can just plug in your new genetic sequence. If variants pop up that are not covered by the vaccine in the future, the way we have to plan so far in advance for the flu vaccine, the way it's done today, you have to start that plan. Sometimes we're wrong about predicting the predominant flu vaccine that's actually the flu virus that's happening that year. I think this is going to change. Messenger RNA vaccines are probably going to change how we do things going forward, because if we need to have a change in the antigen that we're eliciting immune response to, it can be done really quickly now. So I don't know if the other way of doing it, just giving a subunit or a killed virus, is better, but I can't see how much better it could be when you're already at 95% efficacy.
Dr. Holcomb, I'd like to follow up that question with one that we received in the chat that's in line with this one is, can you address the concerns about the mRNA incorporating the virus into our DNA?
Yeah, I've heard that question a lot, and I'm sure the other panelists have. And you know, when you're talking about nucleic acids, it can get confusing. Messenger RNA, transfer RNA, DNA. Going back to just biology classes, the DNA is in the nucleus of the cell, and that's where your genetic code is kept. Proteins are made in the cytoplasm, outside the nucleus. Messenger RNA does all its work outside of the nucleus. It is translated into proteins there. It never goes into the place. So it's almost like a bank vault. All the money's in the vault. The DNA is in the vault. This is all happening in the lobby. Nothing is happening in the vault.
It's a great analogy. Next question is, how are the vaccine recommendations evolving for immunodeficient patients or transplant patients?
You know, I'll handle this as well, because I'm an oncologist as well. And so this is the same argument with pregnancy. You got a group of people that the data suggests have a worse chance of bad outcome from COVID. Patients on chemo, and this came out of the initial Wuhan reports, that those patients had a higher chance of being ventilated, being in an ICU and dying. And yet they were not on these trials because they have the immunosuppression if they're on active chemo. I think it's important to remember a couple of things. They weren't kept off of the trial because people were concerned about a safety concern. There was a thought that maybe being immunosuppressed, you wouldn't mount as robust of an immune response. And so they weren't allowed on, so they didn't want to water down the efficacy. Fauci and the American Society of Clinical Oncology and all these major leaders in oncology have said, you should feel comfortable vaccinating your patients on chemo, but you have to let them know that there's some chance that they may not get the robust immune response that someone else gets. I would rather take a lower immune response to a vaccine, even if it's going to be lower and it may not be 95%, I would still recommend it to my patients because the safety data is there. I think that's better than not being vaccinated at all and just being at risk for natural infection from COVID, knowing that that population has a higher chance of a bad outcome.
Can I add one thing to that?
I was going to add too.
Oh, go ahead, Lenny.
What I was going to say was this may be one of the cases where as time goes on, they recommend that patients, once they are improving from their cancer or improving from whatever caused them to have an immunodeficiency, that they be revaccinated. But only time will tell. But I agree completely with Dr. Holcomb and the recommendations that you get the vaccine, in that some protection is better than none.
The other category that that I've had patients ask me about, they tell me I have an autoimmune disease, I'm on immune suppressive drugs. What should I do? I think the same, you know, it's useful to talk to your rheumatologist, mainly because there may be some situations where they may, you know, decide to pause the autoimmune drug to be able to have you get your good immune response. That's like an individual decision between you and your rheumatologist. But I know that all of the organizations like the oncology group and the rheumatology group are coming out with detailed recommendations. You know, the recommendations are just that. You know, some of this is not based yet on trials, and so some of this may change. And so, you know, we keep on saying we don't know yet, or, you know, likely recommendation. Part of that, which is very disconcerting for, I think, regular people, is the uncertainty. But the reality is we've been dealing, right, with uncertainty for a year, because everything, I mean, everybody has been living how science evolves and how understanding of illness evolves. And now it's how understanding how vaccine understanding evolves. So, you know, I think we have to kind of roll with it as new evidence comes out.
All right, so a hot topic that keeps coming up in the chat here is regarding to children. So we have a couple questions surrounding children. So what are the plans for protecting children since children were not included in trials? Are there plans to evaluate vaccine protection? And then additionally, what are the risks to those children that have predisposed respiratory issues like asthma?
Yeah, you know, as many know, some of the children have had more severe diseases. COVID disease. Asthma is one of the concerns that we have even in adults, patients with pulmonary disease. The trials did not test children. They are moving ahead with that. The Pfizer vaccine had 77 children, if you will, between 16 and 18. It is approved for children down to 16, but we are not in most places in the country vaccinating down to that age. I think it's something that we have to look at. Again, my own journey, a full confession, I have a 16-year-old. So I think that we want to see what the trials show. We want to be aware of what comes up, but I think that the idea that it is not a serious disease in children is not true. It is less severe. There are less severe cases, but it can be very severe. And the other thing is to remember that if a child gets it, they can pass it on to someone else. So even, and as was mentioned earlier, even if I don't get severe disease, that doesn't mean I'm not a risk to someone else. Even if I'm vaccinated, I might pass it on. So I think that some people are going to have to watch and see how the data evolves. But I don't think that if the data is similar to what we're seeing in adults, I think that we could all safely say that the children should be vaccinated. I don't know if anyone else on the panel wants to add to that.
I would just add that I know both Pfizer and Moderna have started trials that will include children. I think Moderna is doing 3,000 teenagers, healthy teenagers, 12 on up, and Pfizer's as well, 12 to 15, because they were doing the 16-year-olds as well.
I think the fact that, that the children are enrolling, the parents are enrolling their kids, speaks to another reality about the reason that the trials were able to be completed quickly. People stepped up to volunteer because this was such an international emergency. Usually when, the people that are involved in clinical research know that you're like searching for people that are willing to be in your study. In this case, people were clamoring to be involved, which was a great public service. But the reason that kids weren't enrolled in the initial clinical trials is that in general, they're viewed as a vulnerable population. And so it would be very unusual to enroll kids in a trial before you showed safety and health in adults. So that's the reason. It doesn't mean that it's like going to be bad for kids. It's just an ethical issue.
Great. Thank you for that. And I think the other really big issue that's kind of come up a couple times from some of our viewers is the reports of potential deaths linked to the Pfizer vaccine from Norway. Can we just talk a little bit about how we might be addressing that as a medical community?
Well, yeah, I'm happy to handle that one. Anytime you vaccinate tens of thousands of people, and give placebo to tens of thousands of people, you will get some deaths that are going to happen in a trial like that. What's interesting is that on both the Moderna and the Pfizer trial, there were actually more deaths on the placebo arm than there were on the vaccinated arm. And when you look at the people who died on the vaccine arm, they were things like heart attacks, things that were not thought to be at all caused by the vaccine. So I think the most important thing to mention is that more people died on the placebo arms of these trials. And so part of the thing of doing surveillance is you have to collect every adverse outcome. I mean, if somebody got vaccinated and committed suicide, which is one of the causes of death in one of the trials, one person committed suicide after getting, I believe that was on the placebo arm. You have to collect all that information, and then you have to look for some sort of biologic plausibility that it could be caused by the vaccine. And then you want to see how does the rate of that outcome, how does it compare to what you'd expect just in any background population? Out of any group of random 50,000 Americans, how many should it die in the next 6 months from a heart attack? You got to look at that background noise. And what came out of these trials was that there's no signal that there was an excess amount of death among vaccine recipients. And so the feeling is that this is not, the deaths were not related to the vaccine.
And if I could add.
Oh, sorry. One of the arguments about, should nursing home residents go first, right? That's been one of the groups almost in every country that's gone first. And one of the fears about doing, the reason that it was felt that it should be done is because a huge number of people that are nursing home residents have died of COVID, as well as nursing home staff. But one of the fears was that people that live in nursing homes are very elderly and very sick. And so a certain number of them pass away from natural causes. And if you started vaccinating nursing home patients and then they died, that would increase the fears in the community about that the vaccines were dangerous. But it was felt that really to be really important that to try to protect this group. There's always going to unfortunately be a certain number of people that will pass, especially all the elderly people that have gotten the vaccine in the trials, and now all the elderly people that are getting the vaccine, after they've been approved. So that's what's the Norway thing. The Norwegian government, at least, and their public health authorities have said that they don't think that the deaths in these few elderly people that have passed away are from the vaccine.
Yeah, someone has messaged me about the fact that Bell's palsy was one of the things that did come up in the vaccine trial. And it speaks to this point. It came up, it's not considered a contraindication because the rate of Bell's palsy was not felt to be above that you would normally find in the general population. But it is one of the parameters that we're following going forward to make sure that there is no association with the vaccine. But again, you always look at what is the normal rate of death from any cause, and then is it increased in the population of people being vaccinated? And the cause for Bell's palsy was no.
Dr. Golightly?
And for people that don't know what Bell's palsy is, just means a facial droop. It's not a fatal thing, but obviously nobody wants to have it.
Since we're either Dr. Golightly or Dr. Morales, either one of you can you answer the one question actually did come up in the chat about the Bell's palsy, and they're asking what is the cause? Why would a vaccine cause Bell's palsy? And can you offer some of the science behind why Bell's palsy would occur? And additionally, I'll add on, do any other vaccines that we currently have on the market also cause Bell's palsy?
You can go ahead. You want me to take it? The thought about Bell's palsy and other neurologic problems, people don't know for sure, basically. Bell's palsy happens sporadically just out of the blue. It can happen after a viral illness. And so we don't always really know what causes it. But there are, I think more importantly, maybe are other neurological problems that are, that people also fear. I went to a session with some of our staff and they were saying, well, I don't want to get it because I don't want to get paralyzed. So I think what that came from was fears of another neurologic disease called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which there was a big fear after the swine flu vaccine. If people remember that era, that was a cause. Guillain-Barré syndrome is an autoimmune disease, and anytime you're doing something to the immune system, what if it could cause that? The issue, I think, and that's a more important thing because it's a more serious disease. That disorder you definitely see in COVID, and just like and a lot of other neurological problems from the disease COVID. So I think that, again, when you do cost benefit analysis of whatever, maybe theoretically, although it has not been reported at all with Guillain-Barré has not been reported with the COVID vaccination, it has definitely been reported with COVID. And so I think the cost benefit analysis, in my view, is still vaccine is better.
I just want to add one thing about Bell's palsy. This came up so many times with friends asking me about this. I was curious to see how is it associated with other vaccines. And it turns out with the seasonal flu vaccine, the risk is about 1 in 1.5 million. So there is some association with the flu vaccine. It's less than 1 in 1 million. And so sometimes you can find things that are clinically, that are statistically significant. In this case, it hasn't been proven to be. But then the real question is that clinically significant? Is that something that you should be weighing heavily in deciding whether I should get a vaccine? And putting things in perspective to say risks at like 1 in 1 million of death, I do risks like that, and I'm talking about a risk of death. You take these risks every day. that are on that level. So I think that it's really important that we know for a population level, if you're going to immunize 300 million people, even something that's happening at 1.5 million per, 1.5 million is important. But as an individual making a decision, I mean, if your doctor told you, I think you should take this, and I think I'm 99.999% sure nothing's going to happen to you, most people are going to say, I can accept that risk. That risk is low enough.
1 in a million is like winning the lotto or getting hit by lightning. Just remember.
All right, so the next topic that has come up in the chat a couple times is based on over-the-counter drugs like acetaminophen. So the first question that we have on acetaminophen up here is, can acetaminophen reduce the effectiveness of the vaccine by interfering with my immune response? How long after the vaccine can it be taken without affecting my immune response?
There is acetaminophen will not affect your immune response. If you have a local reaction or some muscle aches and pains and you want to take some, it's fine.
Great, thank you. So the next question is regarding our equity practices at NYP. So we had a question regarding the availability of registration for our non-English English speaking patients, and what our institution is doing to help increase access to those individuals, especially during the online registration process.
I can address that one. We have, as people know, a very diverse group of patients within the NYP network. And part of our NYP network is the patients that are cared for in the ambulatory care network, the primary care setting predominantly, many of whom don't speak English, many of whom are elderly, many of whom can't use the electronic sign-up system easily. And I'll tell you, even as someone that speaks English and knows how to use it, it's challenging, all these different systems. It's not only NYPs, but New York Cities and New York States. What the ambulatory care network though is doing is it's actually calling every elderly person, the people that are on the Weill Cornell Connect system that have it activated, that qualify for the vaccine because of 65 up, have gotten messages about sign up. But the people that aren't signed up, but that are our patients, are being contacted, are being called because of the concern about this lack of tele access, disproportionately hurting low-income people, elderly people, minority people, non-English speaking people. So that is being taken into account.
I'd like to make a statement about equity with regard to the clinical trials that have been done to show the safety and efficacy of both of these vaccines. I was impressed with their ability to recruit a group of participants that was closely, not perfectly, but closely resembling the racial makeup of the country. And that's because most trials for registration trials for FDA approval don't do that. And the FDA constantly says, we think that it's really important that you do this, and we wish that you would do this. And yet we get these registration trials that tend to have fewer and fewer people of color on those trials. And here in record time, the FDA, 2 companies were able to do multi-site trials that pulled in this pretty diverse group of patients. And so for me, what it did was a proof of concept. I think these companies understood that the disparities that were caused by COVID were well understood and well publicized, and that they were not going to get an emergency use authorization on a trial that did not include Black people and Hispanic people. And it was impressive to me that they were able to do this. And now I think it's going to set a bar going forward that says, the FDA can have an impact on what a registration trial looks like in this way by, I think, making a firmer statement of saying, I'm not giving approval without a trial participation that looks like this. So I'm hoping that this is not something that just we saw with these 2 trials. I'm hoping this impacts trials going forward.
I think the other piece of the equity pie there is the fact that the researchers were diverse as well. And actually, I think the Moderna trial has gotten a lot of publicity because Dr. Corbett from the NIH is a Black woman. and she's been pretty vocal about her experiences. She was a leader of that vaccine process. But people are less aware that the couple of the senior scientists on the Pfizer trial were actually graduates of our New York Presbyterian residency program that I recruited when I was up at Columbia, and the lead senior scientist on the New England Journal paper is Judith Absalon, who's a Haitian American woman. And so we're pretty proud of that connection to the Pfizer trial. And of course, the Moderna trial, we were one of the vaccine trial sites, and our trainees and our colleagues participated in that trial. Many of our colleagues actually volunteered to be trial enrolled. So the fact that I think, in terms of the issue of trust, for me personally, the fact that I personally know people that are part of these vaccine efforts has helped me feel that I know that these are people of integrity and trustworthy folks that would have the best interests of really the world community in mind, and our communities in particular.
Thank you. So there have been a few questions regarding immunity and herd immunity. So one of the questions that we would imagine this would come up. So one of the questions that came up was, Dr. Morales mentioned that we don't know how long natural immunity lasts. Why, if at all, is that different for the vaccine? And following up on someone else's question is, how long would it take for us to get herd immunity if we all took the vaccine?
I don't know if there's a difference between natural immunity and vaccination immunity as far as how long it lasts. I think there's question marks on both of those ends. I think we know from natural infection that you can get infected again. It seems rare, but there have been reported cases of people who had COVID-19 getting it again. Whether or not you'll need a booster from this vaccine remains to be seen. We don't really have in vaccine trials, typically what they try to get is a correlate of protection, some idea of what's an antibody level that if you fall below this, your protection's gone, or how long does it last? And we don't have any of that information on the vaccine yet. The idea that you can vaccinate your way into herd immunity is an interesting question. And Dr. Lambert mentioned that the endpoints of these trials were symptomatic COVID infections, not asymptomatic viral infections. And so we're all hoping that these vaccines prevent primary infection, but we don't know if that's the case. And so this idea that herd immunity just means there's so few people who are susceptible to a disease that are around that a virus just sort of loses its opportunities. It can't jump from somebody to the next and it just dies out. And I don't know if that's going to happen from these vaccines, or will it just be the case that these viral infections are endemic and so many people have them, but they just have so little risk of a bad outcome. And so that they never really go away, but they're just not posing the same public health emergency that they're posing today.
The goal, though, oh, sorry, go ahead, Lenny.
I think the thing about the herd immunity that we need to keep in mind is that herd immunity is only as good if you're going to depend on herd immunity to protect you. That means you're counting on everybody else to have done the right thing. So if people are saying, hey, I'm going to wait, and when everybody else gets it, I will be protected, you're depending on me to have done the right thing, and I may still be able to infect you. So I think that herd immunity should be seen more as something at a country level. How protected is our population? But for you as an individual, if you are not immune, you will forever be at risk. If somebody comes in the room who's traveled from another country where they don't have so much herd immunity and they happen to be infected, they can infect you. If I decide for some reason not to vaccinate my child and my child gets an asymptomatic infection, they can infect you. So herd immunity is a concept of how to protect a population. It should not be confused with how do you protect yourself and your loved ones. It's an unreliable way to do it. And in fact, for many of the diseases that are endemic that we have regular vaccines for, you will note that in areas where people have decided not to take the vaccine, that there will be epidemics every once in a while in that area because people are not immune and viruses were put into the population.
The goal, though, of the vaccine uptake, is around 80% of the population, hopefully at least, in the end. Obviously, there are all these logistical problems right now that are interfering with that, and it's a huge undertaking to vaccinate a whole country. But if we don't get enough people vaccinated, we will still be in this situation of cowering in our homes and fearing infecting each other and never going to a party again. So I think for the purpose of just joy returning in our lives in a different way, it'll be really important for us to bite the bullet and be brave, I think.
So an interesting question just came up in the chat, and given that in terms of just talking about being vaccinated. So an individual has asked, my family member has been asking about why the efficacy of the Pfizer vaccine in Asians is 74%, which is much lower than the efficacy for other racial groups. In India, they are not allowing the rollout of the Pfizer vaccine due to this number. I understand the N is much smaller for Asians in the vaccine trials, but do the speakers have any thoughts about what is behind racial disparities and vaccine disparities? And are they still recommending Pfizer vaccines for Asian patients?
I have to be honest, I wasn't, Marcus, sorry.
The only thing I'll mention is that I think it's simply a matter of the amount of people who identify as Asian who participated in the study, and actually, because remember, these trials, you either get the vaccine or you get placebo, you don't know which one, and then you're sort of monitored for symptoms, right? And the number of people that ended up developing COVID in either arm was actually small. So we just have to, it's a matter of time, and we'll see that those numbers will probably equal out to other race and ethnicities.
There's something called subgroup analysis when you do studies that sometimes can lead to outcomes that later aren't necessarily proven to really be borne out. It's, because we know that there is very little biological difference between people based on their ethnicity. And so it's, I guess I question that.
Yeah, and there was another study by colleagues at NYU that actually helped to confirm that we're not seeing genetic differences. A lot of the differences that we're seeing are really to our social and social economic issues that we find in terms of who are essential workers, who is more likely to be exposed, and that sort of thing.
And I just also wanted to say, I don't know if because of the inability to do really subset analysis of small numbers, whether there really is a difference. But even if you take it at face value that there's a difference, I don't have an explanation for it. But as far as is that still considered effective, I just want to remind everybody that before any of these trials started, the FDA put a threshold for all these companies and say, you got to have more than 50% effectiveness before you'll get an emergency use authorization. So they've knocked it out of the park. I mean, they've gone to 95%. They would have gotten it at 74% as well. And worldwide, you're starting to see the Chinese vaccine and all these other countries coming out with their vaccines. Many of them are at the 74, 75% efficacy mark. And so that's not considered a failure. I just wanted to say that that in of itself would still be something worthwhile doing.
Thank you. So the next round of questions, and a bunch of these kind of questions have come up in terms of communication. So one of the issues that have come up is the misinformation on the internet about things that, about memes and whatnot. And so how do we combat that? And then there's another round of questions of what are some strategies we can use leading with empathy and trying to avoid those arguments with people who might be resistant to getting vaccinated?
I think that for people that have questions, the best way to address it is with truth. So I think that Dr. Morales pointed out quite astutely that there's a grain of truth in everyone's fears and with many other things that are there. There are sources that you can go to, which we listed earlier, and to educate yourselves and try to help educate others. And I think it's important to realize that everybody has fears. I mean, I can't say when they came up with warp speed, and some people on here can testify that I said, hey, I'm not getting it, because I wasn't going to get something that didn't go through what I considered a normal, safe process. And I knew that the process that we had in place here in the United States had yielded safe results in the past. So I think that you need to look at what the questions are, speak to the truth as you can find it in the science and in the literature, and then address it that way. I don't think you can ever help anyone to understand what they need to know if you come at it in a, how could you be so stupid, or how could you be so silly? Even if it sounds silly to you, if you think about it again and you listen to what are they really saying they're afraid about, the thing that they're afraid about might be something it's worth being afraid about, and you want to address, is there any truth in their having problems with that?
I think that especially for those of us that are interested in equity issues, and I think all of us are, and thinking about reaching out to communities of color, unfortunately, it is completely normal and understandable that many people are wary. And what's interesting, I think, about the slide that Marcus showed at the beginning about that actually this crosses racial and ethnic lines, that I think it's just why people are suspicious or wary or nervous, may differ by group, but many people are concerned or anxious about this. And of course, it's floating in a sea of constant anxiety that we've all been living in for a year. And even healthcare workers, many of them are wary about getting in. Many people are declining. Even people that have seen on the front lines, people dying from COVID. So, so what the role is of trauma and stuff like that. So I think that it's really important to be very respectful and empathic with all of our colleagues and friends and family that are anxious about this, and know that for many of them, it's not that they're saying never, they're saying not yet. And that hopefully as time goes on, I think there is a sense of urgency that I have about this, because as I mentioned earlier, the epidemic is escalating, and I do feel like we got to find a way to interrupt it. But the flip side of that is that when you try to twist people's arm into doing something, that's when they resist you. So respectful, empathic conversations, I think, are the way to go.
I just want to add that, and this is very similar to conversations I have with patients all the time with regard to cancer care. I think it's all about how do you approach what's your goal. And my goal in those discussions, even though I clearly have an educated view of what I think is best for the patient, my goal is to provide the information for that person to make an informed decision for themselves. I don't really think of myself as a failure if they end up going another direction than what I wanted them to do. I consider myself a failure if they leave my office and I feel like there was still a knowledge gap that I was unable to bridge. There are going to be some people that you have these these very informed, empathic discussions with, who choose to go another direction or choose not to be vaccinated. I try to remind myself to be humble enough to say, if I look back on this day and I say on MLK Day in 2021, we had over 200 people together and I was advocating for vaccination. If there is some unknown side effect from this and down the line, somebody is second guessing this, I feel good about my decision about what I was telling them, because this is what I knew at the time. But I always have in the back of my mind, I've been in medicine long enough to see things swing back and forth. Right now, with the information we have in front of us, I feel really, really strongly that we have a safe and effective vaccine. But every conversation I approach in the back of my mind with humility that I may feel different about this later on. I feel this way now based on my education and what I've seen.
Thank you, Dr. Holcomb. Thank you, Dr. Golightly, Dr. Morales, Dr. Lambert. This conversation, unfortunately, we're at the 12:30 mark, and we have to move to conclude. And so I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Golightly. But for those who have been asking me about sharing the video, this video will be shared with you, as well as the slides that we had today. And if anyone has any questions, Dr. Lambert will be sharing some resources as well as our contact information for you to reach out to us. And again, we really thank you for being here with us today. Dr. Golightly? Lenny, you're muted.
Thank you so much for that. I'd like to thank all of you for coming today. And I'd like to thank all of my fellow panelists. And so we'd like to end this again is Martin Luther King's Day. And we celebrate his birthday, we celebrate his life, we celebrate his legacy. And I would hope that as we go forward, that we'll all be celebrating that legacy as he referred to education. So the function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. And I hope that you've learned something today about how to think about the vaccines intensively and critically, and that you can pass that on. And that way we'll be honoring Dr. King. I think that the other thing, again, remembering why we're here because of the Biden administration, and that this week there will be an inauguration. And unlike the great day when Dr. King spoke at the Lincoln Memorial and there were crowds all across and he talked about his dream, it'll be a quiet place. It'll be a place where there are troops. And again, he fought violence also. And so what I'd like to do is to remind us all of another part of his speech, his I Have a Dream speech, in which he said to the people that were there and that were going to have to go forward and go out into a world that might not be friendly, that he hoped that out of the mountain of despair, they would get a stone of hope. And I hope that as we go on in this week, that we take that stone of hope, that we fight in all ways that we can by spreading the news about how we can best protect ourselves and our communities, help people make informed decisions. And like Dr. Morales, I look forward to the day when maybe we can all go there to Washington, flood the whole place, from the Congress to the Lincoln Memorial, and have a good party and not have to worry about masks at all. And I know that many of you are going to be helping us get there. So with that, we will say goodbye. Again, all of this information will be available. There are extra resources that are included and additional slides that you'll be able to get. And so I thank you all for coming. And I look forward to seeing you at that party.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Be
See you,
well.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone. God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you all.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.